On December 18th, 2019, President Trump became the third U.S. president to be impeached. In what was largely a party line vote with few detractors on the Democratic side, the House voted on and passed two articles of impeachment that were being discussed: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And on February 5th, 2020, after weeks of political maneuvering and acrimonious debate, the Senate voted to acquit the president of both charges. This, too, was a largely party-line vote, with the notable exception of Utah Senator and former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney, who became the first senator in history to vote to convict and remove a president from the same political party. Even with this defection, both votes fell far short of the 67 needed to remove the president from office. In this case, Republicans in the Senate are pretty mixed with regards to their messaging on acquittal. Some are mimicking the president's rhetoric, calling the whole thing a hoax. Others admit that events happened, but that the president had a compelling motive behind his actions. Others still admit that the events happened, but that the actions didn't merit the standards of impeachable conduct. And yet there are others still who say it was bad, it meets the standards of impeachable, but that for some reason or another, they didn't feel like impeachment was the right call. Again, only one senator, Mitt Romney, said it happened, it was wrong, it's impeachable, and he should be removed. But even with all the fractured justifications and the notable exception of Senator Romney, the outcome of acquittal was never very much in doubt. This is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's basically the head honcho for the GOP in the Senate. Here's what he had to say about impeachment in an interview on Fox News.
And everything I do during this, I'm coordinating with White House counsel. There will be no difference between the president's position and our position as to how to handle this.
And indeed, he tried to do just that. When it came time to propose rules for the trial, he tried to shoehorn much of the arguments so that it would happen late at night, or even past midnight, ostensibly so that people wouldn't be watching on television. It took moderate Republicans pushing back before he decided to allow the trial to take place over a longer period of time, and thus, mostly when people were actually awake. But he was able to get enough members to vote on preventing any additional evidence coming to light, a first in any U.S. impeachment, presidential or otherwise. Many people have concluded, perhaps correctly, that this decision was rigged from the start, and that's constitutionally problematic. Such tight collusion between the Senate and the White House is definitely not what the framers intended for this process. In fact, when they designed the system, they repeatedly insisted that it was the Senate's independence that made it possible to remove a bad executive. At the same time, McConnell's position is entirely rational from an instrumental perspective. This presidency has been especially fruitful for him, netting him 2 conservative Supreme Court justices and a bunch of others throughout the federal judiciary. Plus, it'd be dangerous to go against the president, from an electoral perspective at least. Even if loads of GOP members say that they would evict Trump if there was a secret ballot, and many privately admit that their acquittal vote was mostly based on fear, most Republicans represent states that are solidly on the president's side. In most cases, they believe that rebuking him would cost them their seats and social capital back home. This system seems broken. It's already a given that impeachment and removal is political, but this seems like it's virtually impossible to keep a president in check, especially in the effectively polarized times that we find ourselves in. So I think it's worth asking, did the founders design a bad system? I don't think so. I think in many respects the framers were short-sighted and flawed, see slavery, but I don't think the current impracticality of impeachment falls squarely on their shoulders. I don't think it was bad from the get. I wonder if, instead, we broke it. There has been a lot of changes since the procedures for presidential impeachment was outlined at the Constitutional Convention, and while few of those directly interfere with how the process plays out, I'm starting to think that changes in the overall environment that they instituted means that impeachment is almost impossible to accomplish now, regardless of who's sitting in office. Perhaps the most obvious difference between then and now is the emergence of parties. While the founders were sensitive to the issue of factions, they believed that America could avoid the perniciousness of political parties through sheer force of will. But then these optimists went ahead and made political parties anyways, like a decade later. But, they never bothered to rewrite the document with this apparently inescapable fact in mind. On the one hand, the development of parties means that the interests of the presidents, members of Congress, and senators are more closely tied than they initially envisioned. Their electoral fortunes were no longer purely independent from one another, and there was a brand that needed to be protected, which theoretically makes it much harder for people to convict and remove the president. But for a while, it probably looked like the emergence of parties didn't necessitate a revision to the impeachment provisions. For one, most impeachments were performed on non-partisan actors, members of the federal judiciary. It's easier for people across party lines to vote to convict someone when that person on trial doesn't belong to either camp. But also because American parties are relatively weak. That national brand is pretty watered down. There was a bunch of ideological differences that existed within the same broad tent, which is how the Democrats could accommodate both racial progressives and outright racists from Reconstruction on through the 1960s and 70s. Unlike many systems where parties have a tighter leash over their doctrine and more restraint on individual actors, in the United States, parties were weak enough that individuals could openly espouse things against the party creed and could run still under its banner. And that's still true today, as demonstrated by the fact that many literal neo-Nazis ran as Republicans in 2018, but the party apparatus couldn't do anything about that fact despite the fact that they really wanted to. Part of this weakness comes from the fact that the power of parties is spread between national, state, and local branches, and far more is held and defined by the subsidiary members than in other advanced democracies. But even they have very few tools to stymie individual actors, which is why the state parties couldn't do anything about the neo-Nazis either. Because it is so strongly focused on the individual, that gives a lot of leverage to visible, popular members to define what it means to be a member of that party nationally. Since FDR, the president has been fitting that bill more and more. When presidents are popular amongst the constituents of that party, the official party apparatus often takes their cues from them. Once they've set the standards that the constituents use to judge other members of the party, especially in periods of high effective polarization, then it becomes increasingly electorally risky for them to risk going against the president so visibly, especially on items that literally determine whether or not the person remains president. But the development of the party environment isn't the only thing that changed since the Constitution was founded. There have also been a number of amendments with surprisingly important consequences for impeachment. Since the Constitution was ratified in 1787, it has been amended 27 times. 11 of those amendments, the first 10 and the last one, were among 12 that were proposed basically as soon as the ink had dried. And I think that 2 of these, plus that peculiar institution known as the Electoral College, played a part in making presidential impeachment so hard to pull off. The amendments didn't change the impeachment process themselves, but they were part of a change in the environment where these things happen, and I think that it could have made it substantially harder to enact what the framers intended. First change, the Electoral College, or the fact that we really don't use it. I mean, obviously we use it, that's the whole reason why we're talking about impeaching President Trump rather than impeaching President Clinton, but we don't use it in the same way that the framers envisioned that we would. The intent for the Electoral College was to be a group of learned and trusted individuals elected by the people of a state to select a good president on their behalf. They were going to have substantial autonomy and could reject demagoguous candidates that the people liked, but that they, in their wisdom, saw as a danger to the republic. But pretty quickly, it became the norm for the Electoral College members of a state to represent how the citizens of that state voted. In fact, many states made it illegal for people to vote against the wishes of their constituents, becoming so-called faithless electors. So the president became a more direct representative of the people. Not a totally direct one, but more so than the framers intended. Then you had the 12th Amendment. Passed in 1804, it made it so that the Electoral College had to specify 2 separate votes for president and vice president. Before, the vice presidency went to whoever got second place in the Electoral College vote. This meant that the vice president was often from a different political party than the president. In practice, the 12th Amendment made it so that the president and vice president came from the same political party instead. On the surface, this shouldn't seem to matter. While the vice president presides over most impeachments, they don't preside over those including the president. Again, that job goes to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So why does this matter? Because, as originally intended, the vice president was the president of the Senate and had a great deal of power there. It was only in the 20th century that the position officially became more of a ceremonial role. So let's say the impeachment process is happening under the old rules. The Senate would be voting on whether or not to convict and remove him. It's not impossible for them to be urged on by the person who is A, most likely to immediately succeed the president, B, was their biggest rival in the last election, and C, has considerable clout in the chamber. Even if the vice president wasn't physically there, their presence was certainly felt. Then you had what may be the most important single change to the system, the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913. This made it so that senators were directly elected by the people. Before, senators were nominated by governors, state legislators, generally members of the state's political elite. This, plus their 6-year terms, meant that they were largely insulated from direct public pressure. While the 17th Amendment kept the 6-year terms, the direct election meant that senators now have to deal with direct electoral pressures. They had, and have, far more pushing them to capitulate to the public on highly salient issues. They were no longer immune from little d democratic impulses, which was kind of the whole point of electing a Senate with equal representation per state in the first place. If the president is popular among the people, the senators have to answer to those exact same people should they choose to convict. So while the steps for impeachment haven't changed since 1787, the system in which these steps are embedded in have changed drastically. As originally conceptualized, impeachment would happen in an environment without parties, where independent actors could deliberate and get to the bottom of an issue without feeling like they have linked electoral fates or feel like they are being judged to a standard set by the person who is actually on trial. It would be far more likely to impeach a president in these kinds of circumstances. Their number one rival will be waiting for them in the wings, just hoping for them to screw up. And it would be far, far easier for them to get agreement on a conviction vote. This was ambition counteracting ambition. This is how the framers believed we discourage presidents from malpractice and remove them if they fell to temptation. Now though, parties are a thing. And it's arguably like the worst kind for this sort of thing. One that is institutionally weak but inspires very strong feelings among the people. The president and vice president are from the same political party, and the vice president couldn't curry much favor in the Senate if they tried. Plus, the president and the Senate now effectively share the same voter pool. They are no longer independent. They both have to respond to the same wants from their shared constituents, or else the senators are out of the job. And this is especially true for the senators, who tend to take second fiddle to the president in the hearts and minds of the citizens. It's much, much harder to get a president impeached and removed in the present system, and in periods where party loyalty is paramount, it may be even impossible. So does this mean if we want to fix impeachment, we have to go back and change the other things? Make it so that senators aren't directly elected and that presidents and VPs don't come from the same party? It might be too late to, close Pandora's box on political parties themselves, but could we go back and change the other things? I don't think we have to, which is good because I think that it's normatively a good thing that people are electing their senators. And the system we use up through 1804 was super inefficient. The 12th Amendment has definitely made elections more efficient in the United States. I think that this is one of those cases that in order to fix something, we have to actually break it even more. The example I have in mind is Brazil. Now, Brazil is having a lot of problems when it comes to corruption and executive governance over the last few years, but they were able to get impeachment to work for President Dilma Rousseff in 2016. This despite the fact that the president and VP were from the same broad coalition and that senators are directly elected. I use broad coalition here for a reason. Brazil is a multi-party system with mixed electoral rules and institutionally stronger parties than exist here in the United States. The vice president and president were of a different political party, a compromise needed to form a majority government. And because senators also represent a variety of different parties, there's more room for members to breathe, more chance for them to be able to rebuke the president without facing significant electoral consequences. I'll leave how it works and how the structures embedded there encourage certain outcomes for a later video, but it suggests that one can get impeachment to work if we break the two main parties in the United States into smaller electoral factions. I know that this possible solution dovetails in with a lot of people's complaints about the US, the whole two-party system and whatnot, but it's important to note that while this possibly could fix impeachment, it would assuredly break other things as well. That's because it's not just individual rules that matter, but the overall formal and informal environment that the rules play out in. Changes in context can change the meaning and implication of these rules. But it's tempting to pause for a moment and try to imagine how this would go if the system wasn't like it was today. If it was actually, more like the founders intended. Or even if it was broken just a little bit more. I'd like to give a shout out to Professor Charles Shields at Florida International University, who studies the evolution of American legislative politics. He and I were talking on Twitter a little while ago, and he mentioned that impeachment really is quite different than how the founders intended. That, small one-off tweet, sat on the back burner of my mind for a bit and inspired this video originally at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and then as this impeachment has proceeded, it just started snowballing from there. Anyways, you can follow him on Twitter, and I highly suggest that you do. He's a really brilliant guy, and he's got loads of really good insight. I'm curious to see what you guys think about all this, because again, this is more speculative and theoretical, but I think that it's interesting enough that it's, worth putting out there for y'all to tinker with. So yeah, tell me what your guys' thoughts are about that, about the thoughts that cropped up while watching this video, or suggestions for future topics. I'm more than happy to see those down in the comment section below. I look forward to reading all of them and answering a few in the next office hours. Special thanks to those supporting First Politics on Patreon. I'd like to give a special shout out to Research Assistant Joel. Patrons get exclusive content, early content, and shout outs. So if you'd like to be able to help, you can click down in the doobly-doo or wait till the end card at the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the delay, but impeachment just kept happening, and so this video kept needing updating, and it was, honestly, that's probably for the better because it allowed me to really hone these arguments more and more, but it did cause a delay. Hopefully won't continue. We'll just have to hope and see. Last time we talked about why the legal age to access tobacco in the United States is now 21. Let's see what you all had to say about that. Tim Northrup had an interesting proposal about tobacco laws that I thought I'd point out. His proposal is basically making all drugs legal at 21, making it so that you can only have them at home or where they were purchased, and having a government monopoly on sale and production. Maybe making exceptions for alcohol and marijuana. I think this is interesting. Like, on the one hand, the libertarian-ish streak in me likes allowing people to do with their bodies what they want so long as it doesn't harm others. On the other, the same streak is a bit reticent to endorse government monopolies when avoidable. Like, I'm all for them when it comes to utilities to prevent abuse, but I'm not sure I agree here. Maybe the same argument regarding abuse can apply here. I don't know. I mean, I'm definitely in favor of a government monopoly on the regulation of quality and health standards for these sorts of things. I wouldn't want self-monitoring that just seems ripe for abuse. Yeah, honestly, I don't know. I'm gonna have to mull this over a bit more. Anyways, I thought it was really interesting, so I thought I would invite you guys to chew it all over. And I also really appreciate your last sentence, Tim. Thank you. Hayes mentioned that they were conflicted about the law, asking if there was a grandfather clause and mentioning that they've been trying to quit and has managed to be nicotine-free since November. Congratulations on being nicotine-free. It is super, super difficult. And as another commenter pointed out, no, there actually is not a grandfather clause to this. So, again, congratulations on being free, being nicotine-free, but again, no grandfather clause. If you were 20 and you haven't turned 21, and once the law is passed, you have to wait until you're 21. Oh yeah, and the worst part is I'm actually going out of my way to practice. I've got an app for daily dad jokes. I am straight up just working on my pun game. It is a father's God-given right to torment their children with groanable wordplay, and I am all in on this. A few people noted that it was already 21 in a few places, and actually the same goes for my city, the city that I live in, although not my states. But this brings up an important point about the states' rights here. They could still set more strict laws if they wanted to. It's kind of like minimum wage. The federal government is setting the floor for the standard, but they have every right in the world to be able to exceed that. So it's possible that some states might even bump it up to higher, or could even make it illegal if they wanted to outright. Now, I'm not saying that it's possible in the sense that some states are deliberating this. I'm saying that it's possible in that they have the legal go-ahead to be able to make those moves should they choose to. That'll do it for this week. Thank you guys so much for your comments. I truly appreciate them. Please keep them coming. I love reading them and answering as many of them as I can. So thank you again so much. Links for everything is always be down in the doobly-doo, as well as links to Facebook, Twitter, the blog. Look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you consider giving it a thumbs up. Or support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel and stay in the loop for more awesome social science content is uploaded. We'll be guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload a new video. Be sure to click the bell icon as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.